In order to get like truly amazing things, you actually do need to be irresponsible. This person should be given an award. There was literally a DARPA director who went before Congress, asked for DARPA's budget to be cut. Because the thing is that the more money you give an organization, the more expectations you have from them. The more pressure mounts, the less risky projects you'll undertake.
Hello and welcome to China Talk. What's so special about Bell Labs and why don't they build corporate research like they used to? What's broken about research and development and academia and venture-backed startups? How does this all connect back to the Endless Frontier Act? What makes DARPA so special? To discuss, Ben Reinhardt joins the show. He has a PhD in space robotics, spent time at Magic Leap and in Singapore at an incubator, is currently an independent researcher exploring how institutions foster innovation or not, and his dream is to start an independent DARPA. So Ben, what are the kind of highlight achievements of mid-20th century corporate research organizations?
So just to start, everything that you're probably listening to this on has many transistors in it. Transistors are attributable directly to Bell Labs. On top of that, we are recording this using a personal computer, which is attributable to Xerox PARC, also a corporate lab. But in addition to that, all of the plastics probably came from corporate labs. And then we have everything from like cellular technology to, I'm just like literally looking around the room, like cellular technology. Actually, light bulbs were for the most part developed in corporate labs. Yeah. So and the list just goes on and on. So it's, yeah.
So why did that stop happening? Why are corporate labs, aside from like DeepMind and a few sort of AI related projects, not delivering at the pace and scale that they were in the 20th century?
I think it comes down to a combination of changes in the dominant technologies and changes in the structure of business. Corporate labs, as far as I can tell, depend on monopoly-like profits to give them the sort of the leeway to what I would call piddle around to actually discover really good things. And in the sort of later 70s, early 80s, there's a combination of globalization, financial trouble, pressure from shareholders to really focus on their knitting that made companies not like amped up the competition, made companies specialize. The technologies that corporate labs were working on in the 20th century became commoditized. And so as like a class of technology becomes commoditized, your profit margins go down and there's like more pressure on the researchers to deliver, which backfires and makes everything less efficient. And so to your point about DeepMind, if you'll notice, all the like corporate labs that seem to like really be crushing it happen to be run by software companies who have near monopoly profits, right? So you have Google, Facebook AI research is doing pretty well. And the work of the corporate lab is really aligned with like the core product. If you notice what's going on in a lot of other corporate labs, it's like they're cool projects, but they're like, okay, what does this have to do with the core business of the company? And so there's this like misalignment that happens there. So anyway, the upshot is that there are like many reasons, and it's unclear which one is like the dominant factor.
Ben, what's the idea maze, and how does that connect back to the demise of corporate R&D?
So the idea maze is a metaphor for anytime you're going through a process where you need to make a lot of decisions that are irreversible and you don't really know what the outcome is going to be. It's originally in the context of startups where do you go sell to consumers or directly to consumers or to businesses? It's like, do you do a SaaS model or do you do like single time sales? There's a whole series of decisions that you need to go through. And this is Balaji Srinivasan coined the term the idea maze to describe this. And you could visualize a maze where you're making a series of decisions. And it relates to the demise of corporate research because basically, like, I would argue that corporate R&D now does not give the resources to both start, go through, and complete the maze.
What other corners of research which aren't quite delivering what humanity wants academia. You write that the academic model is built around scientific inquiry, and academics are rewarded for moving up the ladder of abstraction as opposed to engineering design and actually bringing products to the world.
I think that's not necessarily a problem with academia, right? That's just like academia's function is to do this one thing, but then we keep demanding of it to deliver useful products, but just like all of the incentive structures aren't set up to do that. The incentive structures are to focus on like novelty and to basically come up with the most generalizable theory that you can, but what like a really general theory does not a product make.
Yeah.
So academia, and also it's all about credit, right? So the more people you have on a paper, the less quote unquote credit units everybody gets. And at the end of the day, making like good, not even products, but just like working systems takes a lot of people, and people in academia are just not incentivized to do that. So what often happens is that they'll create a proof of concept and say, look, it can be done, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done after that.
The sort of relative lack of emphasis on engineering design, I thought was really interesting. You talk a little bit about where that gap is in academia?
Yeah, it's just, there's, so like when you're doing engineering design, you start with, okay, here's all the possibility space of things I could do, and I need to like narrow this down to say, we need to do this one specific thing. And there's just that doesn't get published. So if you went and like the ridiculous example would be like that you created a working nuclear fusion plant, but you couldn't describe the general principles that you used to do it, that would not be able to get published. And people would not want to do that. That's obviously ridiculous, but to give that example, is that sort of, tell me more about, what about engineering design?
Oh, I guess the sort of the like drive to novelty above all else.
Yeah.
Is also
interesting. And that really is true. I don't know how many times I've heard something, I've just been like talking about an idea to a professor and they say, oh yeah, like that's been done. And it's okay, if it's been done, like, where is it? Why can't I use it? And like, this is the intensely frustrating thing. And so their academia is not set up to make that happen.
So startups and the sort of broader VC ecosystem, why aren't they delivering really exciting innovations broader than outside of like strictly the software space?
Yeah, so like to tie back into the academia piece, I think a common conception is like, oh, it's actually fine that academia will only take something to proof of concept because then you spin it out into a startup and you're off to the races and we've solved the innovation pipeline and we're good to go. But what like startups, especially like VC funded startups, are under a different set of constraints where in order for VCs to really make a return, they need to believe that any single company that they invest in could return like 100-fold or more on their money, which means that like from day one, VC-backed companies need to have a plan for how they get huge. And in engineering design, you need to like, there's still a lot of like experimentation that needs to go on and a lot of just piddling around that you just cannot afford as when you like need to be constantly growing. And so like the necessity of the piddling around to actually do the engineering design that's not being done in academia and the need to grow really quickly are at odds. And so that's why, one, that constrains a lot of things out of existing. And then just to the point about software has like really good economics because the capital cost is almost zero. And so if you can invest in something with zero capital cost, or you can invest in something with non-zero capital cost, and they're both going to give you the same return, you're going to invest in the thing with no capital cost. So that's the argument. Obviously, there are VCs that do invest in things that aren't software, but they're extremely specialized, and there's only a sort of a small subset of hardware that they can reasonably go after.
I did like your line that you can do big, complex engineering products But as long as they look like something that have been done before, so like a telescope or a particle accelerator, like that's fine because there's a model and it's like legible to the, broader funding ecosystem. But anything crazier than that, not just like a 2x bigger, faster, better version of what already exists, has a really hard time making it through the system.
Yeah. And I guess I'm not quite like, it's interesting to ask why that is. It's not completely clear. I think it's just like science funders. My theory is that like basically all science funding is implicitly or explicitly done by committee. And the things that committees are really good at is preventing downside risk. And they do this by basically like slicing off the tails of the distribution. So they won't do anything weird. And so imagine if you're like the first person to fund a particle accelerator and people are like, what the heck is a particle accelerator? So I think that's what we're seeing there.
So now we come to the Valley of Death. What is it and what dies there?
So the Valley of Death is a term for the things that I would describe as too researchy for startups, as we just discussed, and too engineering heavy for academia. And it is, and so basically it's this gap where it doesn't make sense to build a startup around it, or if you do build a startup around it, it's probably not going to do that well. And any work that's done on it in academia is going to produce some papers, but it's not going to actually push the technology forward. So that's, I won't talk about TRLs, but
what's that?
Oh, technology readiness. Another way to think of it is that there's this system called technology readiness levels that NASA and I believe the military use to talk about technology. And TRL-3 is a proof of concept. TRL-7 is a fully functioning full prototype system. And the Valley of Death is like somewhere between those. And so a lot of technologies that require like real research to build systems before it even makes sense to think about a product, especially like general purpose technologies tend to fall into the Valley of Death.
Gotcha. So we're recording this on May 18th. Endless Frontier has passed cloture. The tech directorate, which we talked about last week, is now a shell of its former self, going from $100 billion over 5 years now to $3 or $4 billion over 5 years. It is a dramatic change in the authorization of funding. Ben, I'm curious, what was your ideal for what this new tech initiative, which was supposed to be housed within the National Science Foundation, what was your vision for the best possible scenario of what this new tech initiative within the National Science Foundation could achieve in addressing some of the issues that we've talked about in the sort of degradation of corporate R&D and the inability of academia or venture-backed startups to deliver the kind of to bring the changes from the lab to the bedroom.
I like the bedroom. That's where your most intimate technology goes. So I want to preface this with, I didn't really have a vision. I don't know where you could, I don't think that there's, I guess like the vision is that there is no one place that you can stick $100 billion and have it be useful. And so the thing that I will cry from the rooftops is that we just need more uncorrelated experiments. So instead of the thing that is if you spend all the money in the same way that you have been spending the money before, you literally just go down the list of projects that would have been funded. And instead of funding the top 5, you fund the top 10. And so you're just funding 5 more worse projects of the same type. So what I like, instead of saying this is how it should be spent, I would have wanted more uncorrelated experiments of just, Jose, who was on the podcast, just has a list of like crazy things that we could try. And ideally the money would be spent on things that frankly I think would make a lot of people uncomfortable. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at history, the ways that we've gotten new technology and the people who have done it have like consistently made people uncomfortable. So
let's throw out one or two. Or what are your 2 favorites?
My 2 favorites. If I'm remembering this correctly, the guy who who created synthetic insulin or isolated it from dogs. I'm not sure the exact story, but like he couldn't get a lab, and so he had to break into a lab in order to like do the experiments to distill the insulin from dog pancreases. I think there's a story about him like literally having to crawl on like the ledge of a building and break in. I don't think that I'm making all of that up. That's one example. Another is that we could just take our favorite example, Elon Musk, right? Everybody, including myself, called him a crazy millionaire who is just like throwing away money doing blowing up stupid rockets for years, right? Now everybody's all excited about SpaceX, but it was like everybody thought it was a terrible idea. The NSF would never have funded it. And and let's look at the vaccines that so many of us have. I'm blanking on her name, but the woman who was really instrumental in creating RNA vaccines could not get funding for years and years, right?
Yeah,
and
I do find it pretty obnoxious that the NSF is trying to claim credit for it when this is something that could have existed 15 years earlier, had they written her a check.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like these things where I think universities have also, like universities who like kicked her out also claim credit. But it's, if the NSF wouldn't give her money then, why would the NSF with more money give her, like, she wasn't like rejected because she was like six, like they had 5 slots and she was the 6th. They rejected her because it was like too weird.
Yeah.
So those are just some examples.
So the institution of space funding in America, you hinted at Elon Musk. What doesn't work with the way, I don't know. I don't even know where to start. Like, what isn't right with how American space institutions fund change?
So like the joke I like to make is that, so because NASA is under the executive office, they make 10-year plans that change every 8 years. For a very specific reason. And so if you look back over the past, since Bush, so Bush said, we're going to Mars. And they started building a whole bunch of systems to Mars. And all the NASA engineers are like, yeah. And then Obama comes in and he's like, no, we're going to an asteroid. We're going to capture an asteroid. And then all of NASA reorients around capturing an asteroid. And then Trump comes in and he's like, no, we're going back to Mars. Oh no, maybe Bush was to the moon. Anyway, and then, so Trump's out and Biden's back in, and now we're going back to the moon again. And so every time, it's not like you can just take the one rocket and point it at different places. So the thing that SpaceX is doing right is they're actually building a rocket that you can take and point in different places. But the way that NASA's been doing it is that they build very specialized hardware for very specialized missions. And on top of that, the way that they decide who builds what part of the entire system where is dictated by the Congress people who hold the purse strings. So they'll say, well, I'll fund this if you build part of it in my district. And so you end up with this Frankenstein org structure and piece of technology that ends up with the SLS that we have now, the Space Launch System, which, if you pay any attention to it, it is just one failed test after another. Like, I think in the time that SpaceX launched 3 or 4 starships and like actually got it to land, they test fired the engines for SLS once.
Which is unfortunate. So how do we fix space?
Again, I don't know. I'm really hesitant to propose broad solutions. And I want to propose small steps. I think so one thing that NASA has done really well, let's give credit where credit is due. The commercial launch program has been really great, right? Like SpaceX would not exist without NASA giving them money. So I really do actually want to call that out. I think more of that, more of NASA as goal setter, funder, and like market maker almost. There's this thing called advanced market commitments where effectively NASA can say, if you build a thing to this spec, we will pay this much money for it. Mm-hmm. And that is amazing for the system, because what it does is it then lets startups and other people go to funders, and instead of having to make something up, they can say, look, if we do this, NASA is sitting there with a checkbook, and all we have to hit these targets, like no questions asked. So get rid of cost plus contracting and just say, we will pay this much money for this spec, and do a lot more of that. I think would be a step in the right direction.
Gotcha. DARPA. Let's talk a little bit about its track record. What does it have under its belt?
Oh man, GPS satellites, stealth technology, the internet, which was originally named ARPANET, personal computing, most of modern robotics, miniaturize, like the GPS that's in your phone, like the vaccine again. DARPA funded some of the early work on RNA vaccines. Should I keep going? Surgery robots. Yeah, the list, those are just the things that I have cached at the top of my tired head.
Let's do a brief history of its institutional evolution.
Yeah, 1958, Sputnik is launched by the Soviet Union. Dwight Eisenhower wants to do something. They quickly scramble together this government organization that is just meant to do all sorts of weird special projects. And basically, they're just given like carte blanche to do a bunch of weird stuff. And the well-known early programs from NASA were in personal computing led by JCR Licklider, which was originally just because the early warning systems were so terrible that they like would see like the light would reflect funny and make it seem like there's a incoming barrage of nuclear missiles and almost lead to nuclear war. So they wanted to stop that, but he did a lot of other stuff. There was a lot of other weird stuff figuring out like, oh, if we nuke the atmosphere, will it create a cloud of radiation that will destroy incoming missiles? So they actually went out in the middle of the South Atlantic and nuked the atmosphere. We don't hear as much about that. And so over time, they did a lot of projects and a lot of really good early work. Basically, DARPA is responsible for most of the computer science departments in the United States. Eventually, like the Vietnam War happens. In 1972, there's and so DARPA is set up with this like really weird structure where there are these program managers who basically get, as soon as they convince the director that they have a reasonable idea, which literally can be a 10-minute meeting, they have like tens of millions of dollars to just distribute however they want. 1972, a lot of reforms around military spending are passed. What was called ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, is renamed DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And its scope is tightened to things that have direct military application, which is still a vast array of things, from medicine to robotics to any kind of electronics. And it's like DARPA has had its fingers in really every major technological change in one way or another. Like they really pushed the semiconductor industry. And so over time, I guess that's, is there anything like, and so just like so since 1972, they've really, I guess the extraordinary thing is that they've managed to consistently fund and make hits happen over the course of many decades, which is very rare and very surprising.
Why? How?
That is, again, that's the several billion-dollar question. But I would argue that a lot of it has to do with the fact that program managers are allowed to do things that other people are not. So they're willing, like they can, let me back up. I think that it's a combination of empowered program managers who can basically just like, they don't have to go through a bureaucracy. And at the same time, it has to do with coordination that would not happen otherwise. So you actually have someone who really gets it and is technically trained with a strong hypothesis of the steps that technology needs to go through to actually become a useful thing, as opposed to just like a proof of concept.
Let's talk about the magic of the program managers for a second.
Yes, please. So they're not magical. They're real people. I've met them. They're great. But the program managers, they basically just get these like extreme badasses. They can be from, some of them are professors, some of them are from industry, but they get people who are able to see the big picture, but at the same time understand technical details and really put, like, I'm making scare quotes, but do the program design to say, okay, if we can do this piece and this piece, figure out what are the puzzle pieces, what could you assemble with them, what work needs to be done, both to build the missing puzzle pieces and to put them together, and then go and make that happen. And they have a lot of leeway to do that without asking a lot of permission.
I like the idea of creating networks, but not just plugging into ones that already exist. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's this idea, I called it focused network building, but research has become extremely specialized, right? So people who like work with one kind of laser will feel uncomfortable talking about something that to anybody else in the world looks exactly the same, but is with a different laser. And they're like, that's not my area anymore. But then you also notice that so many new awesome things come from like collisions of ideas. So what program managers will often do is convene these workshops where they get together a bunch of people who actually can all contribute to the same problem, but may not know each other. So for example, like you would have like a video game designer in a room with a roboticist in the room with a machine learning expert in the room with a psychologist. And you can start to imagine like what could come out of that. But those people, they just don't run into each other in their professional lives. And so the program managers have this like big picture of who could contribute, bring those people together and stir the pot.
Can you drill down a little bit on what makes DARPA different from the Bell Labs and Skunk Works of the world?
Yeah, I think besides the fact that it's run by the government, I think the biggest difference is that DARPA doesn't do research. DARPA is tiny. It has around 100 program managers and a whole bunch of contracting support, like a bunch of support staff. But the program managers themselves, they're like only levers is spending money. And so they go and they give grants or contracts to academic labs or private companies, as opposed to Bell Labs or Skunk Works, where the majority of the work is done by employees of Bell Labs or Skunk Works in-house. And both of those have different strengths and weaknesses. But like the primary difference is internalized versus externalized work.
Just today, Senator Sass submitted an amendment to double DARPA's budget. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. There was literally a DARPA director who went before Congress. This person should be given an award. They went before Congress and asked for DARPA's budget to be cut. Because the thing is that the more money you give an organization, the more expectations you have from them. And the more pressure mounts, then the less risky projects you'll undertake. So I would expect DARPA to almost be like crushed under this amount of money. And it's so much less about the amount of money and more about how you can deploy it. Do you know what's going through people's heads when they just think, oh, we'll just spend more money on a thing?
In Congress?
Yeah.
Presumably they're just like, this is what works. Let's see if we can get 2x of it working.
But like, I feel like that's not how economics works, right?
Well, here's it. Maybe we'll turn that into a broader question. Do you have any idea of where the Pareto frontier is for like national R&D dollars, be that research or development?
So the thing is that like the dividing line between research, which is this like exploration, like unscheduled thing, and development, which is like, okay, we have like deadlines, we can really target things, is like you have to go back and forth because like you're doing development and then all of a sudden you realize this like problem that you have to do research on, and then you do some research and you need to do some development. So it's really just like a big cycle, and saying, okay, we're going to give this money for research, this money for development is, I think, just a little silly. But the Pareto front is like, in terms of, I don't think that there's a Pareto front in terms of a number. I think the Pareto front is in terms of what activities are we enabling and what activities don't get enabled. And the thing that I see in my soapbox is that it's much more important to enable more different activities than it is to enable more of the same activities, namely like academically incentivized work, or which is like what the majority of federal dollars are going towards.
Yeah. How is sci-fi underutilized?
Like being a giant nerd. I think that it could actually really be used as a tool for thought. Right now, people say, "Oh yeah, it could be like a big vision," but you can almost use sci-fi as I think of it as like a case study from the future, where unlike these like very one-dimensional predictions of AI is going to do X, sci-fi explores a world in which there is AI. And instead of saying AI will do X, it's like unpacks all of the secondary effects and helps you think about it, because with just like a straight up prediction, you can't really poke any of the pieces. But if you've ever hung out with a bunch of geeks, that like twiddling with doing like what if on sci-fi is really easy. So I think it just gives people a better way to think about the future. And then also it's a way of just like developing much more concrete visions, as opposed to we're going to do something cool with graphite. It really helps to say, okay, we're going to try to build like this particular kind of jet from this sci-fi series.
Book recs.
Sci-fi book recs. I've just been reading To Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. It is freaking amazing. It is the one sci-fi book I've seen that presents a really plausible scenario for what a post-nation state world looks like, and it's just really well written. There's all the old classics everybody should read, like Foundation, Dune, most of Heinlein. I especially like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. The Culture series is one of the few that present a almost like plausible, optimistic future. Yeah, I think those are the sci-fi off the top of my head.
All right, nonfiction.
Nonfiction. Pasteur's Quadrant. I am a really big fan of Loonshots by Safi Bakal. There's this book called Cycles of Invention and Discovery, which presents a much better framework than basic and applied R&D. The Idea Factory from about Bell Labs is pretty incredible. So like Vannevar Bush's autobiography is actually really good. I believe it's called A Piece of the Action. Michael Nielsen's Reinventing Discovery is great. I'm just thinking of the ones that like I keep going back to. Yeah, I think that's a good list. Oh, yeah. Anything else? I think I'm really interested in your thought about the best way, like what is the theory of change behind writing policy papers, and how does the endless frontier not end up in the way that it is right now? Like, this feels like a little bit like, of course this was going to happen. So how does that not happen? What do we do to make that not happen?
I don't know. I'm really bummed. This is quote unquote anti-China research, like an anti-China type research bill is, I think Marco Rubio had a good line. He was like, look, if we can't come together and pass a bipartisan bill about anti-China competitiveness, like we should probably put the Senate out of business, because then we really can never do anything. It's unfortunate, but this is how democracy works, is there are interest groups, and there are regional players who want to make sure that there are folks in the House and Senate who want to make sure that their states get funding, and it makes sense that they would be more comfortable with putting money towards a system which already does that, in particular for New Mexico and the labs which are there, which are the main beneficiaries of the extra tens of billions of dollars which are going their way, as opposed to this new organization. Though that said, the idea of setting up a new organization and all of a sudden throwing it $20 million in its first year is an aggressive one, to be sure, particularly when this is in a sort of space that you said where smaller amounts of money can go an incredibly long way. So the idea of spreading out bets, I don't think is terrible. There are lots of players who have the ear of Congress, from those former NSF presidents to university presidents who lobbied in particular to make sure that more of their money was going into funding streams that they feel confident that they can take advantage of going forward. It's interesting because one thought that occurred in some like sort of one thought that came to mind for me was like, okay, if we're going to create this NSF structure, is there something that we want to subtract from the kind of research ecosystem? Maybe I'll throw this one back at you. Like, what do you think should not exist, Ben?
I'm going to make so many people hate me. University administrations should be gone. I think like a lot of the work that national labs do is really like make work. Frankly, I think the whole thing just needs to be like scaled down. I think it was Michael Nielsen who really did propose the thought experiment of, could we get better research if we just cut the money? Like literally just like less money, what happens? And like everybody who is a scientist who applies for grants, please don't hate me. It's not, it's like, I really do want people to do good research, but as an ecosystem, there's an argument that just like the competitive pressures are like crowding things out.
How so?
So there's this paper called The Decline of Unfettered Research that basically makes the argument that the more money we put into research and the more people there are, the more it becomes a commodity and we like expect consistent results. But by expecting consistent results, we kill the thing that is at the core of research, which is like this like high variance like discovery. Whoa, look at this thing. Because if you know that you have to deliver something in 3 months, you're not going to work on the weird project. You're going to work on the thing that you can deliver in 3 months. I think so. So get rid of reporting requirements. Get rid of accountability.
What are reporting requirements?
Oh yeah, just like whenever you get a federal grant, you have to tell them exactly what you're spending all the money for, and every semester or every reporting period, whatever that is, you have to say exactly how much money you spent, exactly what you spent it for, and if you don't, or you screw that up, or you spend it on the wrong thing, they take your money away. And very often it's required that you spend most of the money on grad students, which propagates a whole other problem. So decouple research funding from this idea of like training America's research workforce, which like you see that rhetoric all the time. And so it's like, why decouple it?
Yeah.
Because what ends up happening is that all the money gets earmarked for grad students, and that incentivizes people to do grad student heavy research, which makes it so that nobody will invest in building research tools, makes there be too many grad students. So now you have, if you look at the number of grad students versus professor positions, the number of grad students is increasing exponentially. The number of professor positions is basically holding constant. And so you have all these people just like, and that ramps up that competitive pressure that we were just talking about. Sorry. So it's this like very
this is great.
Complex. It's this very complex system that's all feeding on itself. And it's just, yeah. So the really awkward thing is that all these things I'm saying to cut, they exist for a reason, right? Like the reporting requirements exist because at the end of the day, it's taxpayer money. It's like your money and my money technically. And like, I don't want the government to be irresponsible with my money. But at the same time, I would argue that in order to get like truly amazing things, you actually do need to be irresponsible.
Gotcha. We try to be irresponsible here on the China Talk podcast.
And that's
Ben
why
Reinhardt,
I love it.
Thanks so much. This was such a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Thanks, Jordan.
Nominate driving my real life prepare on the straight make it hey 我嘲笑那些听众没品味 Let me pay 在 SKB 刷爆卡消费配合的 cash money 8点也2点起飞3点才排个准备评论区特别的 say 档期都背靠着背跑慢的 miss 的 busy 时间也变得宝贵原谅我飞得太高总看不清同行跑位 fuck 输的歌全都背别拿我和他们对比内核你无法拷贝我们抓的是快歌的配练最次是 TV 宝贝 represent 倔强的眼睛不在乎引头销毁代号是从不早睡让眼红的牙都要碎我工作室坐满了玻璃搭配上星星表妹听过了太多的 flow 就偏偏爱你的老辈 Give me a way to go back 我记不清喝的好醉 我们邻有人觉得我的鞋特别累从不歇拍个照比个耶动不动消失了好几月 Only feel the small comp but can never catch up 钻山基因才爆 stand wrong 我们差距太遥远我们邻有人觉得我的鞋特别累从不歇拍个照比个耶动不动消失了好几月 Only feel the small comp but can never catch up 钻山基因才爆 stand wrong 我们差距太遥远Shining风风像是 BBA 我摆动了不用排队拿了麦干不会给发了 my face 鱼蛋杯的米成都在意大利风格是地的绿盛开像比特币你摸不透我的冲击让你感觉很 lonely 老子里面装的都是你不敢想的东西我的兄弟们负担大我消防队也不能扑灭来前的路子很宽我们还有很多 意。行业具体的人们不管白天还是午夜，我存在对你来说就是最致命的毒瘾。我赚快的钱来中了压迫我的脊椎，血锅里流的红牛永远都不值得匹配，续不来的歌曲那就请你坐下乖乖闭嘴。